I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on nutrition programs for the heat-stressed herd by Jose Santos. This particular webinar is brought to you by DairyXnet. DairyXnet is a national extension-driven web resource which is designed to meet the educational and decision-making needs of dairy farmers, allied industry partners, extension educators, and consumers. I am Donna Amaral Phillips, Extension Dairy Specialist here at the University of Kentucky, and I am today's host. Without much ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Jose Santos. He is our speaker today to talk about nutrition programs for the heat-stressed herd. Jose earned his DDM degree in Brazil in 1992. After working in dairy practice for a year in Brazil, he moved on to the University of Arizona to study ruminant nutrition, where he learned his master's degree in 1995, and in 1997 his PhD degree. He completed a clinical residency at the University of California, Davis in 2000 and then joined the faculty there. And in 2008, he actually moved on to the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Florida, where he currently is at, where he does research and extension activities that relate to dairy nutrition and reproduction. His primary research and extension efforts focus on the interface between nutrition and reproduction and the methods to improve postpartum health and fertility of dairy calves. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Santos to present our webinar today.
Thank you, Donna. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you in the East Coast. I hope you can hear me well, and I hope you can see the images on your screen of the slides for the next 35 minutes. I want to acknowledge my collaborator, Dr. Charles Staples, who is part of this effort, and also our research team that's working on the issue of heat stress in lactating dairy cows. Heat stress dairy cows experience many changes, and a lot of this is probably nothing new to most of you. Cows change their behavior. They spend less time lying down. If you look at observations of animal behavior in freestall barns, you will see that in most barns, cows would spend anywhere from 11 to 13 hours lying down. However, when they are exposed to heat stress, because of body temperature and the ability to circulate air to lose body temperature, a lot of those cows will actually spend less time lying down. They also spend less time ruminating. Ruminal contractions are reduced, in part because of lower feed intake, but also even when cows are actively consuming feed, rumen contractions and rumination are reduced when exposed to heat stress. There are increases in CO2 losses due to hyperventilation because of panting. Because of reduced rumen contractility, retention time of feed in the rumen is extended. So that leads to increased fermentability of whatever is consumed by the cow. These cows typically have a deficit in bicarbonate, but they can also have deficits in sodium and potassium content because of increased perspiration and losses through sweating. They have reduced blood flow to the portal drain viscera, so there's less blood flow into the digestive tract. There is less nutrient uptake by the portal drain viscera. There's also reduced blood flow to the mammary gland and increased requirements, caloric requirements, to dissipate the additional heat that's accumulated in the body. So typically cows have to dissipate the same amount of heat that's produced every day to maintain thermal neutrality. So the end result of all of these changes is a less productive animal. So dietary strategies are during this period of heat stress aim to minimize some of those impacts in the dairy cow. So consequences of heat stress are reduced dry matter intake, reduced yields of milk and milk components. Not only yields of components are reduced, but also concentrations of protein and fat primarily are also reduced. In the case of growing animals, there is reduction in growth. There is obviously a decrease in reproductive performance, as you heard from Dr. Todd Bilby a few weeks ago. But there's also an increase in the incidence of health disorders, particularly those associated with the reproductive tract. There are many more cases of retained placenta and metritis during heat stress, and there is a marked increase in the incidence of lameness in heat stress dairy cows. So this makes this subject very complex. And part of the nutritional program is an attempt to minimize some of those impacts. Unfortunately, better producing cows suffer the most from heat stress. These are data from two experiments, one conducted in Missouri, in which cows are exposed to hot, humid environment, and the other one conducted in Israel, in which cows are exposed to a hot environment but less humid. And one thing you can see here is that if you look at cows that were segregated in two groups, those producing up to 28 kilograms per day, approximately 62 pounds of milk, and the high-producing cows, which average approximately 37 kilograms of milk per day, approximately 82 or 84 pounds of milk per day. You can see that higher producing cows, they suffer more with heat stress than lower producing cows. They have a greater increase in body temperature than the low producing cows when exposed to heat stress. So there is an additional heat production in higher producing cows because these animals have greater feed consumption. So as our cows become more productive, the challenges with heat stress will increase. Needless to say that most of the benefits in terms of intervention associated to minimize the impact of heat stress will be associated with heat abatement in cooling cows. So nutritional strategies are one of the components of management of cows under heat stress, but the most important one will be primarily heat abatement. A series of really interesting experiments have been conducted by researchers at the University of Arizona. And what these people wanted to answer was how much of the reduction in performance of cows is driven by reductions in feed intake or is driven by changes in tissue metabolism. So what they did in one of those experiments was to expose cows to a controlled heat stress that resembled what happens in the state of Arizona. In other words, hot and moderately dry weather. They did this for a short period of time. They had also a group of cows that were under thermal neutrality, but they were subject to pair feeding. In other words, those cows had exactly the same dry matter intake as the cows that were exposed to heat stress. So when you look at this slide here, the figure on the top is the dry matter intake of cows. Here is the pre-treatment period, and here is the 7 days of exposure to either heat stress or to pair feeding. And you can see that they were successful at keeping exactly the same dry matter intake between the two groups. And heat stress reduced the intake by approximately 30%. However, when you look at milk production, you can see that cows exposed to heat stress had a greater loss of milk production than those that were pair-fed. So the difference here in milk yield between the two groups is approximately 4 or 5 kilograms. Okay? So in fact, heat stress reduced milk yield by approximately 45%, whereas pair feeding, in other words, cows that were under thermal neutrality but had exactly the same dry matter intake, their milk production was reduced by approximately 19%. This indicates, or when they account for the amount of reduction in production that is accounted for by the reduction in dry matter intake, only half of it can be explained by that. So there are other factors, factors associated with tissue metabolism, or perhaps factors associated with mammary gland function that, induces this loss in production. So what are some of the management strategies in terms of diet manipulation that can be utilized to minimize the impact of heat stress? The first one would be to monitor dry matter intake, feeding frequency, and feed delivery. And then we're going to discuss a little bit about manipulating diet composition in an attempt to improve animal performance during heat stress. Well, I don't think I have to mention this, but sometimes people forget that water is a critical nutrient. In fact, water, in terms of amount consumed per day, is the number one ingredient or nutrient that cows need. And cows will double their water intake during heat stress. So situations such as this in which cows cannot access the water trough, or when cows have their typical behavior of consuming water when they walk to the parlor or from the parlor or when they consume feed, if that is restrained or if they don't have free access, obviously this will make the impact of heat stress worse, will further decrease dry matter intake and productivity. An interesting thing is that cows experiencing heat stress, they do drink more, cows experiencing subacute rumen acidosis, they do drink more water. And there are some interesting experiments in the literature in which cows were induced to have subacute rumen acidosis, and they had the opportunity to consume water with or without a buffer, sodium bicarbonate. So what these folks in Canada did, they replaced a portion of the TMR with a blend of pelleted barley and wheat to create this subacute rumen acidosis model. And then for a period of 3 hours, they offered cows water that was either plain water or water that was supplemented with 2.5 grams of sodium bicarbonate per liter. And this is what they found. The mean rumen pH, as expected, was reduced when cows were induced to have subacute rumen acidosis. When they look at the proportion of the water drunk by the cows that was enriched with sodium bicarbonate, they didn't really see a difference. So if you look at this part here of the slide, cows had the option to drink water with or without sodium bicarbonate. And you can see here that in the control cows not exposed to rumen acidosis, almost 40% of the water that they select to drink came from sodium bicarbonate supplemented water. Whereas for subacute rumen acidosis, that was 36, so basically no difference. But if you look at water intake, you can see that exposure to subacute rumen acidosis increased water intake. So why am I saying this? The reason why is because cows exposed to heat stress are at a higher risk of developing subacute rumen acidosis. And water consumption has the ability to minimize drops in rumen pH. In fact, consumption of water flushes out the acid that can accumulate in the rumen, and that leads to a temporary increase in rumen pH, which is beneficial to rumen health. So if you look at the same experiment here, they measure rumen pH in those cows before and after a bout of water intake. And you can see for control cows, drinking water increased rumen pH by approximately 0.15 pH units. But in the cows that were exposed to heat stress, it brought that up from 5.7 to 5.9. So a marked increase in rumen pH by consuming water. So one can interpret this data by thinking that cows that are exposed to heat stress and may be more prone to subacute rumen acidosis, they might consume more water. And when they consume water, that benefits the rumen environment, which is important. What about feeding frequency? We know that increasing feeding frequency typically increases dry matter intake, and this is not mimicked by just pushing feed. There is a stimulatory effect of feed delivery on cow behavior. So cows get up, they go and they consume feed. And pushing feed does not seem to have the same effect. During heat stress, cows have greater intake at those critical times, typically after milking, but also during the cooler periods of the day, which is usually early in the morning or during the night. So if we provide feed more often, such as in these experiments here conducted in Canada, in which cows were fed either once compared to twice daily, and they observed the proportion of cows that were actively eating in the feed bank, you can see here that when cows were fed once a day, they had one big bout immediately after the morning milking, and they had two smaller bouts immediately before the afternoon milking and after the afternoon milking. However, when cows were fed twice daily, the second bout of intake was much greater, therefore stimulating cows to consume feed. Interestingly, when they further increase feed delivery to 4 times a day, which is the green line, those cows experience 2 additional bouts of intake at each respective feeding. One here, in between the morning and the afternoon milking, and an additional bout of intake in between the night and the morning milking. So increasing feed delivery typically stimulates cows to go to the feed bank and actively consume feed. And this has advantages for a heat stress cow because this will minimize slug feeding and will stimulate greater dry matter intake, which is one of the challenges during heat stress. So because heat stress reduces intake, and because cows exposed to heat stress usually have increased requirements, caloric requirements to dissipate heat, a lot of people in the past have thought that maybe if I increase the caloric density of the diet, this would benefit cows that are not consuming enough nutrients. Another reason is that digestion of fiber typically increases heat production in the digestive tract. Digestion of fiber is less efficient, and digestion of fiber generates more heat, such that the digestive tract consumes more oxygen. So this poses, in theory, disadvantages to feeding high fiber diets to heat-stressed dairy cows. But when experiments are actually done in which cows under heat stress are fed diets with moderate levels of dietary fiber, such as these in Georgia, you can see that when cows are exposed to heat stress, which are the yellow line, increase in dietary fiber up to 34 to 37% of the total dry matter had a minor, if any, impact on dry matter intake in terms of kilograms per day. When we look at dry matter intake as percentage of body weight, you can see that increase in fiber content of the ration had no effect at all. Whereas cows that were under thermoneutrality, increase in dietary fiber decreased dry matter intake in kilograms per day, as well as percentage of body weight. So heat-stressed cows, they have lower dry matter intake, no doubt about it. But when fed higher than the typically fed NDF in the ration, which are the values on the bottom, The values on the bottom here represent the concentrations of fiber in the diet. When the amount of NDF increased to 34, 37, basically no difference in dry matter intake was observed in those heat-stressed cows. Such that when we look at production of milk and production of 3.5% fat-correct milk, increase in fiber actually improved milk yield and improved fat-correct milk in heat-stressed cows. So during heat stress, although in theory we would think that we need to increase the caloric density of the diet by replacing forage with concentrate, cows seem to respond differently and they actually benefit from additional fiber. And this may be related to the changes that take place in the digestive tract, as I mentioned before, that may induce a higher risk of subacute rumen acidosis when cows are under heat stress. To illustrate this point, you can see this slide here in which cows were fed either a high forage or a high concentrate diet. And then they were exposed to either cool or hot weather. You can see here that exposing to hot weather decreases rumen pH in both cases. But the depression in rumen pH is greater in the high concentrate diet. So the combination of trying to increase energy density of the ration by adding more concentrate, particularly higher starch levels, with heat stress can lead cows to a greater risk of rumen acidosis. And that is an important component of manipulating diets, is to minimize potential health problems. Another point that's important to this aspect of rumen health during heat stress is that cows exposed to high ambient temperatures, they tend to have fewer rumen contractions. So the number of rumen contractions or rumination, time spent ruminating per day, is reduced. Here are 3 experiments, one in Florida, one in Missouri, and one in Maryland. In all 3 experiments, every time cows were exposed to heat stress, ruminal contractions or remastication rates were depressed. This leads to reduced ability to absorb the acids produced in the rumen. So the VFAs that are produced during digestion can only be absorbed by the rumen epithelium if the content is actually in contact with the epithelial cells. So ruminal contractions are compromised. The ability to clear the acid produced in the rumen is also compromised. That leads to increased acid accumulation, which leads to reductions in rumen pH, as I mentioned in the previous slides. So that increases the risk of cows to develop rumen acidosis. And it's no surprise that lactating dairy cows under heat stress, they might be at greater risk of rumen acidosis given what I mentioned in my previous slides. One of the consequences of these changes in behavior and rumen acidosis is a potential increase in the incidence of lameness. This is data from a 6,000 cow dairy farm in which the first lameness case was recorded in their computer software, their herd management software. And you can see here that in the months of August to November, which coincides with the end of the summer and the early fall, the number of lameness cases increased. After that, the number of lameness cases decreased, and they begin to increase again during late spring, early summer. So that is part of the change in behavior, cows spending more time standing. But maybe there's a contribution to from the increased risk of rumen acidosis. So what other strategies? If we should not increase energy density by adding more starch, what else can we do? We can increase the dietary fat content. We know that fat has more calories than carbohydrates. Fatty acids do not generate gas or heat production. So urinary and gas losses are minor when cows digest fatty acids compared to when cows digest carbohydrates. So this may increase energy density of the diet in a time that cows do not want to, or they should not generate additional heat. So I'm going to show you data from one experiment at the University of Wisconsin where in which cows were exposed to controlled ambient temperature. They were either under a cool or a hot environment. And you can see during the cool weather, supplementing fat improved fat-cracked milk. And during the hot weather, supplement fat also improved fat-cracked milk. Okay, so in both cases, supplementing fat to dairy cows improved milk production. At the University of Arizona, we conducted a series of experiments looking at response to fat feeding when cows were under moderate or under heat stress. So it's no surprise that control cows under heat stress consume fewer calories, as well as cows supplemented with fat. The important thing is that in both cases, energy intake increases. And because of the increase in energy intake, milk yield is also increased. So supplementing fat to dairy cows exposed to heat stress is one of the strategies to improve milk yield without adding additional acid load to the rumen. Another aspect of formulating diets is to manipulate the dietary protein. Usually, diets that are high in crude protein have a detrimental effect to cows under heat stress. Protein degradability and quality are critical, and when formulating diets, particularly typical diets in North America that are composed by corn grain, corn silage, alfalfa hay, paying attention to specific amino acids is important. So in the case of typical diets fed here, methionine and lysine tend to be the most limiting amino acids. On the other hand, if you go to some of the European countries in which cows are fed grass silage or barley and oat-based diets, there may be other amino acids that may be limiting to milk production, milk protein production. So here is a compilation of experiments in which cows were fed different proportions of rumen degradable protein as a percentage of the total crude protein. And you can see that in these studies here, every time rumen degradable protein was increased, or in this case here, decreased, milk yield increased. So overfeeding rumen degradable protein can have a detrimental effect to cows under heat stress. So formulating diets in terms of protein, nutritionists and veterinarians should pay attention to the total amount of protein as well as the quality of the protein that's used. One of the important components of diets for heat-stressed cows is the mineral composition of the ration. And the reason for that is because heat stress tends to induce metabolic alkalosis because of hyperventilation. So cows tend to hyperventilate to dissipate heat, and with that they lose excess of CO2. So this leads to increase in blood pH, but in fact total bicarbonate is reduced. So cows have less bicarbonate reserves at the same time that they experience metabolic alkalosis. These cows also increase sweating rate, and ruminant sweat is high in potassium, so the needs for potassium actually increases. And at the same time, they have less intake. So we think that altering the mineral composition of the ration will benefit metabolism and production of heat-stressed dairy cows, because that may affect rumen metabolism, blood buffering, and that eventually leads to changes in milk yield and milk fat content. Let me just show you a compilation of data. This is a meta-analysis in which the authors looked at the impact of the dietary cation anion difference in the ration. This is the summation of strong cations and strong anions. So as the amount of strong cations in terms of equivalent increases relative to strong anions, the adjusted dry matter intake also increases. And you can see that intake is optimal when the decad of the lactating diet is about 350 milliequivalents per kilogram or 35 milliequivalents per 100 grams. This results in improved milk yield. So lactating dairy cow rations should contain additional buffers such as sodium, but also systemic buffers such as potassium to improve the decad, which stimulates milk yield and dry matter intake and consequently milk yield. And this will have also additional effects on milk fat content. Both bicarbonate as well as potassium have positive effects on milk fat synthesis. So lastly, I'm only going to touch on a few additives that have been explored in terms of their impact on performance of cows under heat stress. Two of them are yeast cultures, or fungal cultures. So these products have the ability to stimulate fiber digestion in vitro. They have the ability to reduce lactic acid accumulation because they tend to stimulate proliferation of lactate utilizer bacteria in the rumen, and they tend to improve feed efficiency and conversion of feed into fat-correct milk. So there are potential for the use of those additives to improve performance of dairy cows under heat stress. So here's a compilation of experiments summarized at the University of Arizona in which cows were fed fungal culture or not during heat stress. In most of the studies, or in half of the studies, supplementation with this fungal culture had a benefit to milk yield and rectal temperature. We don't really know how this affects rectal temperature, but feeding Aspergillus oryzae in half of the experiments benefit milk production significantly. The same is true when cows were fed yeast culture. When cows were fed either live yeast or yeast culture, lactation performance or feed efficiency were improved. So here is a study in California during the summer. Milk production was improved, efficiency was improved. Study in Georgia, milk production was improved and feed efficiency was improved. In South Dakota, feed efficiency was also improved. And in Illinois, milk production was improved by supplementing diets with yeast culture. So yeast culture has also the ability to minimize shifts in rumen pH. In this experiment here, cows were fed different amounts of live yeast, either 0, 0.5, or 1 gram per day. And one of the interesting findings was that cows that were fed 1 gram per day of live yeast suffer less from rumen acidosis, so a smaller proportion with low rumen pH, and the average rumen pH was also higher. So there is a potential benefit to modulate rumen function by adding either yeast culture or live yeast to heat stress dairy cows. So recommendations. Cows exposed to heat stress, they should be fed more frequently because it stimulates intake. It may have other properties such as reducing spoilage in the bunk. Cows under heat stress should be fed the highest quality forage because that allows formulation of diets with more forage that minimize the need for high starch feeds. My personal opinion is that during heat stress, cows should be fed higher fiber diets. And there are ways to do this. We can use non-forage high fiber byproducts such as soybean hulls, which has the ability to increase energy density, has the ability to not add to the acid load in the room to the extent that starch does, and it has the ability to not suppress feed intakes as observed with other high fiber byproducts. Formulate diets with moderate concentration of crude protein. We know today that there's no need to formulate diets with more than 17% crude protein to high-producing dairy cows. Make sure that rumen-degradable protein is not excessive, but there is enough to support microbial growth. Treat moderate to high fat diets, so a maximum of approximately 5% total fat content in the ration. Just avoid excessive amounts of unsaturated fatty acids. I think it's really important that we increase the amount of strong cations in the ration by adding sodium bicarbonate and by adding potassium carbonate. We typically add 1 to 1.2% of the total ration of sodium bicarbonate. This represents approximately 1 to 2 percentage units of effective NDF in the ration in terms of buffer contribution. But diet should also have increased potassium content to 1.6 to 1.8% of the total dry matter. Every time that's done, make sure you pay attention to magnesium concentration in the ration to not cause hypomagnesemia. It's very critical. I think you should supplement either live yeast or yeast culture to the ration of heat-stressed dairy cows. There is substantial data today indicating that there is an increase in milk production observed during heat stress as well as cool periods. Typical response will be approximately 1 to 1.5 kilograms per day. It consistently improves feed efficiency, and some of those products reduce the risk of rumen acidosis, which is beneficial to these cows under heat stress. So with that, I'll finish here, and I'll be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. We'll go ahead and take a few questions that are in the box there. The first one that was put in there is, what is the impact of a decreased rumen contractions upon the rate of passage, specifically rumen retention time of dietary components and the effect that it has on rumen digestion of those components?
Yes, Dawn. Cows that have reduced rumen contraction will have extended rumen retention time, so feed will stay in the rumen longer, and that will increase fermentability per unit of feed consumed. So in other words, the amount of digestion per unit of feed consumed will be greater, which is a good thing. The problem is that it will also increase the amount of organic acid production, VFAs, per unit of feed consumed. And the best way to dispose of the excess of VFA, or that excess of hydrogen produced in the rumen, is absorption. To have absorption, the rumen has to contract because VFAs cannot cross the epithelium unless they are in close contact with the cell. So by having fewer contractions because of perhaps hyperthermia is affecting a contractility of the muscle in the digestive tract, this reduces VFA absorption or rate of VFA absorption. That leads to accumulation of VFA in the rumen. In other words, leads to accumulation of acid that decreases pH and may be responsible for the changes in rumen pH that I showed you. Okay? So that may have consequences to the cow. Although on one hand it's beneficial to increase ruminal digestion, particularly of carbohydrates, on the other hand, we don't want to have excessive amounts of acid accumulated in the rumen because that increase in osmolarity and the decrease in pH further exacerbates hypocontractility that can lead to even fewer contractions and eventually to rumen atony. I don't mean that this is going to happen all the time, but having lower contractions or fewer contractions will compromise VFA absorption and will increase the risk of acid accumulation that may lead to greater prevalence of subacute rumen acidosis in those cows. I hope I answered your question.
Another question from your colleague that wishes you a happy birthday. Obviously, we know that feeding more frequently, cows eat more often, but not necessarily more. And on the other hand, they stand longer, maybe increasing the risk of lameness. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, if you feed more often, there are data demonstrate that not only they spend more time eating, or they actually go to the feed bank more often. They don't necessarily spend more time eating unless they consume more feed. Okay, but by feeding more often, cows spread their meals throughout the day on a more homogeneous manner, and that would be beneficial to every cow, regardless of heat stress or not. So a typical cow will have 8 to 12 bouts of intake a day, but they do have these 2 or 3 big bouts every day, which is right after the morning milking, or right after the first meal of the day, before the afternoon or evening milking, and right after the afternoon milking. Those are sort of typical things the cows do in confinement situations. If we can spread those bouts throughout the day and have meals in which cows don't have to slug feed, in general, that would be beneficial to digestion and to rumen health. So I agree that if all you do is stimulate cows to stand, this may have repercussions to long-term claw health. But if cows stand and they actually consume feed, this would be very beneficial because now they can have shorter meals more often, which would alleviate problems in terms of foot health, and it would also alleviate potential problems in terms of excessive amount of acid produced in the rumen because a cow had a large amount of feed consumed at a given time.
One of the comments that's often made is that heat stress occurs obviously in the southern part of the United States, but I think heat stress also occurs in the northern part of the United States also. Maybe not for as long a duration, but obviously there is heat stress. I mean, if you look at some of the work out of Arizona, looking at heat stress starting with a THI of 68 now versus 72. Any comments about the differing in feeding approaches when you look at length of duration of heat stress? I mean, obviously, it's pretty warm in the southern part of the United States right now. Obviously, these probably won't last as long as it will later coming in. But talk a little bit about differences in length of heat stress and its impacts on nutrition programs.
Yeah, you know, I think probably somebody, either Todd Bilby did or maybe Pete Hansen will. You know, almost every place in the world where dairy cows are, they will experience some period of heat stress during the year. Perhaps the exception would be New Zealand or in southern portions of Chile or Argentina. Even Canada experiences heat stress. If you look at their records for the summer months, they have losses in milk production and they have losses in reproductive performance. So heat stress is common to almost every place where dairy cows are. Obviously, if you look at the United States, the southern states suffer the most, particularly in the southeast because of the high humidity that makes dissipating heat much more difficult. It's a whole lot easier to dissipate excess heat under a dry weather compared to humid weather. It's a whole lot easier to evaporatively cool cows in a dry weather than in hot and humid weather. So no doubt about that states like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, so on and so forth here in the southeast will suffer more than other places because of the high humidity, also because of the longer period of time. But if you go to places, for example, like California, where they may have water in the barn, they may use soaker lines to cool cows, but they don't use fans, they can create a microenvironment that is hot and humid, very similar to what happens in the southeast. The difference in some of those places is that once cows go outside of the barn, particularly at night, they can compensate, they can dissipate the excess of heat that's accumulated during the day, whereas in the southeast, if cows go outside of a freestall barn, it's always humid outside. So dissipation of accumulated heat is not as easy here. So that has long-term consequences. But as I look at DHI records and computer records, we typically see losses in production starting in May, June. It becomes really bad in July, August, and recovery takes a long time because now, the transition cows went through heat stress. There's shifts in patterns of calving throughout the year, so there's other changes with the seasonality that takes place with reproduction that puts pressure on the farm. So I believe heat stress is a worldwide problem, at least for high-producing dairy cows, worse in the southern hemisphere, really bad in the southern portions of the northern hemisphere, but affects Canada and northern Europe as well as many other places.
I think the last question that came in, I think you may have touched on a little bit about southern hemisphere. Pretty much the question is the difference between northern and southern hemisphere, looking at Brazil versus here as far as the heat stress that they experience in more the southern hemisphere.
Yeah, one of the issues in South America is that, or let's say in the case of Brazil, is that most of the country is in the tropic area. So Brazil may have 3 or 4 months of cool weather. Most of Brazil will be under temperatures above 22, 25 degrees Celsius for most of the day throughout the year. And during half of the year, humidity is high because of the pattern of rains. So Brazil, for most part, is very similar to the southern portion of the U.S. To some degree, can be even worse because depending upon where you are in the southeast, you do get a relief during the end of the fall, the winter months, and the early spring. The temperatures and humidity will be more acceptable to a lactating dairy cow. So the challenges in countries like Brazil, most of Africa, South Asia are much greater than most of the United States, just because cows are exposed to a longer period of heat stress. There is greater humidity for most of the year, and there's less relief, natural relief.
Well, Jose, on behalf of Dairy Excellence, I'd like to thank you very much for presenting our today's webinar on nutrition and its effects with heat stress. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and close this session of the webinar. And thanks to all the participants for participating today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donna.